The world remembers World War II for its massive battles, the storming of beaches, the fire raining from the skies, and the millions of soldiers who marched across continents. But behind the loud, visible war, there existed another war, one almost nobody saw. It was fought in whispers, in dimly lit rooms, in enemy-controlled cities, and deep in forests where radios crackled with coded messages. This hidden conflict involved people who often had no uniforms, no official recognition, and sometimes no realistic hope of rescue if things went wrong. Their mission was simple: do the things that could not be done by armies marching in formation. Before the United States entered the war, it had almost no intelligence capability of its own. Other nations already had sprawling networks of spies and covert units. Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union all had established espionage systems long before American troops ever set foot on foreign soil. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the United States realized something crucial: it could no longer rely on outdated or scattered intelligence work. It was time to build something new, something capable of operating in the shadows of a global conflict. That responsibility fell to one man, William "Wild Bill" Donovan. A decorated hero from World War I and a charismatic visionary, Donovan believed the U.S. needed a centralized, coordinated intelligence force. With President Roosevelt's approval, he built the Office of Strategic Services, known as the OSS. This organization had one goal: to gather intelligence, disrupt the enemy, and conduct the kinds of missions that could change the war without anyone ever knowing they happened. The OSS eventually became the modern CIA. But during the war it was more like a mixture of spies, researchers, psychologists, linguists, commandos, and even magicians, anyone with a talent that could be useful in tricking or undermining the enemy. These kinds of secret missions have remained hidden for many reasons. Some were illegal under international law. Some involved cooperating with criminals or resistance fighters that governments did not want to publicly acknowledge. Other missions were so sensitive that revealing them could have endangered people long after the war ended. And, of course, during the Cold War that followed, many of the techniques pioneered in World War II were still being used, so keeping them secret was considered essential. The hidden war did not take place on the same battlefields everyone knows. It unfolded behind enemy lines in France, in the thick jungles of Burma, inside occupied cities in China, in the deserts of North Africa, and even on the streets of American towns where enemy agents attempted sabotage. Covert operatives often worked in pairs or small groups, carrying forged documents, miniature radios, small explosives, and sometimes a cyanide capsule in case the worst happened. Instructions were often brutally simple. If you are caught, we cannot help you, and officially, you never existed. What did these missions accomplish? Far more than people realize. They sabotaged enemy supply lines, helped resistance movements coordinate attacks, gathered critical intelligence before major battles, and misled enemy commanders into making disastrous decisions. These missions required a different kind of bravery. One where failure meant disappearance rather than death on a battlefield, and where success often meant that no one outside the mission would ever know what had been achieved. In this series, we will explore the missions that shaped the war from the shadows, operations involving deception, infiltration, psychological warfare, sabotage, and daring escapes. You will learn about inflatable tanks that fooled enemy divisions, spies posing as enemy soldiers, networks of resistance fighters armed and trained by Americans, and covert units that helped rewrite the balance of power in the Pacific. This hidden war was every bit as real as the one fought with tanks and bombers, and its impact continues to echo through history. In the next part, we begin with a mission involving enemy agents on American soil, and the secret American response that stopped them. In the summer of 1942, while much of America focused on battles overseas, a quieter and far more unsettling story unfolded at home. It began not with American operatives setting out on a mission, but with a group of German saboteurs landing on American shores. Their goal was clear: cripple America's industrial backbone, destroy critical infrastructure, and create chaos far from the front lines. What followed became one of the earliest examples of America's invisible war on its own soil, and the secret actions taken to stop a threat that almost no one knew had existed. 4 German agents arrived first, landing in the dead of night on a beach near Amagansett, New York. Dressed in German Navy uniforms to avoid being executed as spies if caught immediately, they buried their clothes in the sand, changed into civilian outfits, and prepared to disappear into the American population. Their mission was part of a larger German operation, an effort to strike fear into the American public by attacking transportation hubs, aluminum factories, power plants, and even Jewish-owned department stores. A second team landed days later near Jacksonville, Florida, with similar goals. That was the plan. But something happened that the Germans had not predicted. One of the saboteurs, George Dash, had no real loyalty to the Nazi mission. He had lived in America before the war and opposed the regime he was supposedly serving. Shortly after arriving in New York, after narrowly avoiding discovery by a lone Coast Guard sailor on the beach, Dash made a decision that changed everything. Instead of carrying out his orders, he traveled to Washington, D.C., walked into the FBI, and attempted to turn himself in. At first, agents thought he was insane. But when he dumped thousands of dollars in Nazi-provided cash onto the desk and revealed details only a trained saboteur would know, the FBI realized the threat was real. Now came the secret part. The government could not allow public panic. If the country learned that Nazi agents had landed in America, traveled on American trains, stayed in American hotels, and planned to blow up factories that supplied the war effort, the psychological damage could be enormous. Instead, the FBI quietly launched a covert effort to capture every member of both teams. Agents tracked them down across multiple states, secretly arresting them without letting newspapers or local police departments know what was happening. Within 2 weeks, all 8 saboteurs were in custody. What followed was swift and brutal. A military tribunal, closed to the public, sentenced most of the saboteurs to death. Dash, the man who had turned himself in, avoided execution but was imprisoned. Years later, long after the war, he was deported back to Germany, a man hated by the Nazis and distrusted by Americans, belonging to neither side. But beneath the legal proceedings, something else was happening. The U.S. government realized that if German saboteurs could land on an American beach, more could follow. The need for a stronger counterintelligence network became urgent. This single operation pushed America to strengthen its internal security systems, improve coastal surveillance, and expand its intelligence efforts. It became one of the catalysts for building a far more sophisticated covert defense structure, one that would soon rely heavily on the OSS and newly trained operatives specializing in uncovering enemy plots before they could unfold. Though the public eventually learned fragments of the story, most of what happened behind the scenes. The surveillance, the secret arrests, the improvised countermeasures, remained hidden. It was one of the earliest examples of how America fought a shadow war on multiple fronts. In the next part, we shift our focus overseas, where American operatives prepared to infiltrate occupied Europe and work alongside resistance fighters who risked everything for small chances at freedom. Long before American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, small teams of covert operatives were already slipping into Europe, moving quietly through shadows cast by Nazi occupation. Their job was not to seize territory or engage in open battle. It was to prepare the ground for an invasion that the world didn't yet know was coming. They needed to build networks, gather intelligence, train local fighters, and help weaken the German grip from the inside. These early missions were dangerous in a way that went far beyond enemy bullets. Being caught didn't mean becoming a prisoner of war. It meant disappearance, torture, and execution without a trace. Yet volunteers continued to come forward, driven by a mix of courage, desperation, and a belief that the war could not be won by conventional forces alone. The agents who entered occupied Europe were an unusual group. Some were professors, others were linguists, athletes, social workers, journalists, actors, or former criminals. Anyone with a useful skill could be recruited. They carried forged passports, counterfeit ration cards, and small radios broken down into pieces that had to be reassembled behind enemy lines. Most of the time, they traveled alone or in pairs, posing as farm laborers, traveling merchants, or displaced citizens moving from town to town. Every detail had to be perfect. The accent, the story, the clothing, even the way they walked. A single inconsistency could lead to a knock on the door at midnight. One of the earliest challenges they faced was gaining the trust of local resistance groups. These groups were already risking everything by sabotaging German trains, hiding escaped prisoners, and smuggling information to the Allies. But to them, an American stranger could just as easily be a German infiltrator sent to expose their operations. Trust had to be earned slowly and quietly. Sometimes an operative spent weeks simply observing, listening, and proving they were not a threat before they were allowed to join planning meetings or access safe houses. Once trust was established, the work accelerated. Agents trained resistance fighters in small hidden rooms or forest clearings. They taught them how to use explosives, create timed detonations, operate radios, and carry out surveillance. They helped them obtain weapons, often dropped by Allied aircraft during moonless nights. These drops were coordinated through coded messages broadcast on the radio in ways only the resistance would recognize, simple lines that sounded meaningless to ordinary listeners but signaled life or death instructions. Even a single act of sabotage could have enormous consequences. A derailed supply train could disrupt German troop movements for days. A destroyed bridge might force a division to reroute. Information about troop concentrations or fortress layouts could shape Allied strategy in ways that saved thousands of lives. But every act increased the danger for everyone involved. After a successful operation, German forces cracked down brutally, searching homes, demanding papers, and making arrests based on the slightest suspicion. For the American operatives, the danger was constant and personal. They carried small escape kits sewn into their clothing and memorized multiple exit routes through cities and mountains. They changed locations frequently, slept in barns or abandoned structures, and traveled at night. Even meeting with the resistance was a gamble. A wrong turn or an unexpected patrol could end everything. Yet despite the risks, their presence allowed fragmented resistance groups to coordinate in ways they had never been able to before. These early efforts laid the groundwork for some of the most important operations of the war. They provided intelligence for bombing raids, helped unify resistance movements, and prepared Europe for the day when Allied forces would return in full force. And although many of these operatives vanished into the fog of history, their impact was enormous. In the next part, we'll follow one of the most unusual and creative American units to operate in Europe. A group that fought the enemy not with bullets, but with illusions and deception. As the war in Europe intensified, the Allies realized that defeating the German war machine would require more than strength and numbers. It would require confusion, massive, disorienting confusion. And so a very unusual American unit was created, made up not of traditional soldiers but of artists, sound engineers, set designers, actors, architects, and a few misfits who didn't quite fit into conventional military roles. Their mission was not to destroy enemy forces, but to deceive them so completely that they made decisions based on illusions rather than reality. This small collection of creative minds would eventually mislead German commanders into moving entire divisions based on nothing more than art supplies, loudspeakers, and clever imagination. These operatives operated close to the front lines, sometimes just miles away from German positions. Their effectiveness depended not on force but on presentation. They used inflatable tanks made of rubberized fabric, lightweight artillery pieces that could be carried by a few men, phony radio transmissions, and sound effects blasted through massive speakers. The idea was simple: make a small group of soldiers look and sound like a much larger one, then quietly slip away before the Germans realized they had been tricked. One of their most powerful tools was sound. Engineers recorded the noises of tank battalions, truck convoys, and large troop movements. These recordings were modified to match specific environments: echoes for forests, muffled tones for open fields, sharper bursts for villages. Massive amplifiers mounted on vehicles could project these sounds for miles. To German listeners, it often seemed as though an entire armored division was rolling into place, even when no such unit existed. The deception forced enemy forces to react, shifting resources and preparing for attacks that would never come. The visual illusions were just as impressive. Inflatable tanks were designed with remarkable detail, complete with painted shadows and markings that made them look real from aerial reconnaissance. Soldiers hoisted them up and rotated them to simulate movement. Jeeps dragged metal chains behind them to create tracks in the dirt that resembled those of heavy vehicles. From a distance, or from photographs taken by German spies, it appeared as though entire battalions were assembling. These illusions disrupted German planning and bought crucial time for actual Allied forces to maneuver. But deception required more than props. It required performances. Soldiers practiced walking and talking like members of various divisions. They wore the correct patches, used authentic slang, and constructed fake command posts with convincing detail. They even created phony military police checkpoints to sell the illusion to any wandering eyes. Every aspect of the performance had to be perfect because even one inconsistency might expose the operation and put real troops at risk. One of their most daring missions took place late in the war, when Allied forces needed to cross the Rhine River. To conceal the true crossing point, the deception unit built a fake encampment miles away, complete with imitation artillery, dummy boats, and alternating patterns of movement that suggested preparations for an assault. German forces diverted significant attention to the decoy, weakening their defenses where the real crossing would occur. The operation worked exactly as intended, saving countless lives and speeding the Allies' advance toward Germany's heartland. Of course, these operations were not without risk. The unit was often placed near active combat zones, and if the Germans discovered the deception, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet the small team continued to operate, relying on creativity and improvisation in situations where most soldiers relied on firepower. Their work remained classified for decades. Many of the participants returned home without ever telling their families what they had done, believing that their contributions would be forgotten. But their impact was enormous. They showed that wars could be shaped not only by strength, but by imagination, and their success paved the way for modern psychological operations. In the next part, we move from Europe to the Pacific, where a different kind of covert warfare unfolded deep within jungle territory controlled by the Japanese. Half a world away from Europe's forests and cities, another invisible war unfolded in the dense, humid jungles of the Pacific. Unlike the deception missions in Europe, the covert operations in the Pacific relied on stealth, survival skills, cultural knowledge, and the ability to move through unforgiving terrain without being detected. The jungles of Burma, the Philippines, and parts of China were some of the most dangerous environments in the world, thick with insects, disease, heat, and an enemy that knew the terrain far better than most American troops. Yet this was exactly where covert teams were sent, often with almost no support, to gather intelligence, rescue prisoners, assist local resistance, and sabotage Japanese operations. These missions depended heavily on building relationships with local populations. In many regions, villagers and native fighters had been resisting Japanese occupation long before the United States entered the war. They knew the paths, the hidden trails, the river crossings, and the places where Japanese patrols rarely passed. But the Americans needed more than guides, they needed partners who trusted them, and trust was not easily granted. To earn it, operatives often lived with local families, learned their languages, worked alongside them in daily tasks, and proved through action that they were committed allies rather than temporary visitors. One of the most successful examples of this cooperation occurred in Burma, where American operatives formed a close partnership with the Kachin people, skilled jungle fighters who had resisted Japanese rule with whatever weapons they could find. The Kachin fighters were unmatched in their ability to move silently, set traps, and navigate terrain that seemed impenetrable to outsiders. Together with American advisors, they formed small resistance groups that conducted raids on supply lines, destroyed bridges, ambushed patrols, and guided lost Allied pilots and wounded soldiers to safety. Their efforts significantly disrupted Japanese operations in the region, and their knowledge of the jungle saved countless American lives. Operating in the Pacific required a different mindset than missions in Europe. There were no bustling cities to blend into, no train stations to observe, and no crowded markets where messages could be passed discreetly. The primary threats were isolation and exposure. Simply surviving the environment was a challenge. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever could incapacitate a team faster than enemy fire. Supplies were scarce and had to be airdropped into small clearings hacked out of the jungle. Radios failed constantly due to humidity. Maps were often inaccurate or completely non-existent. And yet, the agents pushed on. One of their most critical roles was gathering intelligence on Japanese troop movements. Because the Japanese military often relied on foot travel through remote areas, their movements rarely showed up in aerial reconnaissance. Local scouts and American operatives tracked these units on foot, sometimes trailing them for days. They sent coded radio messages to Allied command centers, allowing generals to anticipate enemy attacks or plan ambushes. In several cases, small teams were able to warn Allied forces of large Japanese movements that might otherwise have overwhelmed isolated outposts. Another essential mission involved rescuing downed airmen. The Pacific Air War was brutal, and planes frequently crashed deep within territory controlled by the Japanese. Without covert ground teams, many pilots would have been lost forever. Operatives risked their lives to locate crash sites, treat injuries, guide survivors through the jungle, and bring them to safe zones where aircraft could extract them. To the pilots, these covert teams were nothing short of lifesavers, appearing out of dense foliage when hope seemed lost. The Pacific covert operations demonstrated that intelligence work was not limited to cities and coded messages, it could be just as vital in the harshest natural environments. These missions weakened Japanese forces, supported local resistance, and helped the Allies advance through territory that would have otherwise been impossible to navigate. In the next part, we'll explore a different kind of covert contribution. The secret linguistic weapon that helped secure victory in the Pacific without a single codebook being captured, United States faced a serious problem. Every code system the military created risked being cracked, and the Japanese had already shown an ability to decipher complicated encryption methods. A single captured codebook could jeopardize entire operations. But there existed a solution, one that didn't come from machines or cryptographers in laboratories. It came from a language, spoken by a group of Americans whose homeland had existed long before the United States itself. These were the Navajo code talkers, young men who turned their ancestral language into one of the most unbreakable communication systems ever used in war. To most Americans at the time, Navajo was a language they had never heard. To the Japanese, it was completely unknown. And even if they had encountered it, the structure and complexity of Navajo made it nearly impossible to learn without growing up immersed in the culture. There were few outside the Navajo nation who could understand even the basics, and the U.S. military realized that this unique linguistic barrier could be its greatest advantage. So a small group of Navajo recruits were brought together, asked to create coded terms for military equipment, tactics, and commands using their own language. What they produced was a communication system that could relay battlefield messages faster than any machine and with absolute security. These young men were placed wherever communication mattered most: beach landings, artillery units, reconnaissance teams, and forward command posts. On D-Day, style assaults across Pacific Islands, they were often among the first to step ashore. Bullets tore through the air, explosions shook the ground, and in the chaos, these operatives knelt behind rocks or in trenches, rapidly transmitting messages that determined troop movements and artillery strikes. Their voices carried instructions that saved lives and prevented units from being trapped or overwhelmed. Every second counted, and their speed gave commanders a level of responsiveness they had never experienced before. What made their work even more extraordinary was the secrecy surrounding it. They could never tell anyone exactly what they did. Many returned home after the war to families who assumed they had served as regular infantrymen. Some faced discrimination despite their incredible contributions. Their role was classified for decades, and only late in the 20th century did the public learn how crucial they had been. But on the battlefields of the Pacific, their presence was invaluable. Entire campaigns unfolded more smoothly because enemy forces simply could not understand the communication networks supporting American operations. Their success came not only from the complexity of the language but from the system they created. Instead of directly translating English words, they developed coded substitutes. For example, they used Navajo terms for animals to represent different types of aircraft. They crafted entire vocabularies that allowed them to speak quickly and with complete accuracy. Even if a Japanese codebreaker had somehow captured a Navajo speaker, the coded substitutions would still have been impossible to unravel. It was a layered system that defied every attempt at infiltration. The code talker supported major operations across the Pacific, including the battles of Iwo Jima, Guam, Saipan, and Okinawa. During the brutal fight for Iwo Jima, Marine commanders credited their message speed and reliability with helping coordinate one of the most complex amphibious assaults of the entire war. Some officers later said that without them, the battle might have dragged on far longer and cost many more lives. By the end of the war, hundreds of Navajo code talkers had served, each carrying the weight of a mission that would not be publicly recognized for generations. Their role stands as one of the most effective and least conventional contributions to the American war effort. And now, as the script nears its conclusion, it's time to explore one final layer of the invisible war, the secret alliances, hidden negotiations, and covert relationships that shaped the world after the guns fell silent. As the war approached its final months, the battles became more intense, and the stakes rose higher than ever. Yet behind the front lines, another kind of struggle was taking place, one that would help shape not only the final outcome of the conflict, but the world that emerged afterward. While soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific, American operatives were engaged in quiet alliances, secret negotiations, and covert efforts to secure a future beyond the war. Their mission was no longer just to defeat an enemy, it was to prepare the geopolitical landscape for what would come next. Allied victory was becoming inevitable, but how that victory would be managed was far from certain. In liberated regions of Europe, resistance groups that had fought in the shadows for years suddenly found themselves without a clear direction. Some were armed, organized, and eager to influence the political future of their countries. Others were divided by ideology. American operatives were tasked with making sure these groups transitioned from clandestine fighters to peaceful citizens rather than sparks for new conflicts. They met secretly with resistance leaders, negotiated the return of local authority, and worked to stabilize regions before full governmental control could be re-established. At the same time, the United States faced a new and delicate task, gathering intelligence on its own allies. The Soviet Union, though vital in the fight against Germany, had ambitions that worried American leaders. Covert operatives were instructed to observe Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, report on their political maneuvers, and anticipate potential tensions that might erupt once the common enemy was defeated. These early intelligence efforts foreshadowed the Cold War. In some cases, American agents even attempted to protect certain resistance figures from Soviet arrest, knowing that many anti-Nazi fighters were also anti-communist and thus at risk once the Red Army advanced. There were also secret diplomatic missions that remained classified long after the war ended. Some involved contacting high-ranking officials within collapsing enemy governments, not to negotiate surrender, but to gather information about war plans, hidden supply caches, and the locations of prisoners. Others focused on securing scientific research to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. American operatives raced across parts of Germany in the closing days of the war to locate scientists, laboratories, and technological documents before Soviet forces reached them. These efforts would later influence global advancements in rocketry, medicine, and intelligence technology. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, covert operations took on an urgent tone as American forces prepared for the possibility of invading Japan. Agents worked with local resistance in regions still under Japanese control, gathering information about fortifications, troop sizes, and civilian conditions. They also attempted to identify potential intermediaries within the Japanese government who might support surrender, hoping to avoid a massive ground invasion that would cost countless lives. Some of these back-channel communications helped lay the groundwork for the terms that eventually ended the war, even if the participants never received public recognition. Once the conflict finally ended, the world did not simply snap back to its pre-war state. Millions were displaced, cities lay in ruins, and political boundaries were shifting. American operatives continued their work, helping track down remaining enemy agents, dismantle secret networks, and support the reconstruction of countries where chaos threatened to fill the vacuum left by retreating armies. Their missions evolved from wartime sabotage to delicate post-war stabilization. For many of these operatives, their contributions would never be acknowledged. They returned home quietly, carrying memories they could not share, proud of accomplishments they could not discuss. They had fought an invisible war, one without parades, without public honors, sometimes without even documentation. Yet their efforts shaped battles, preserved lives, and influenced the balance of global power for decades to come. And so the story concludes not with a dramatic final mission, but with the quiet understanding that history is shaped as much by unseen hands as by the forces we recognize. The Invisible War was never meant to be celebrated. It was meant to be effective, and in that, it succeeded.